called a social ecological system. There is a whole research field behind it, but basically what I want you to remember is that we are talking about some interrelated system of people and nature which influence each other, and it's characterized by really complex relationships. Because, I mean, when you imagine your own lives, I guess that you can somehow figure out that things that are going on are quite complex. They're influenced by different people, by the places where you live, by the places where you lived in the past, by things that are happening to you, and all these things influence each other. And the same thing that is valid for you as individuals is valid for whole systems and for the Earth in general. So whatever we are going to say here today is based on the idea that whatever we do as humans and whatever nature does as nature is just closely linked to each other and influences each other. And the way I'm saying it is that this idea of these two parts of the Earth influencing each other, that's quite old. But then recently the way of thinking that's emerging, and that's also reflected in Sustainable Development Goals, which I believe you already heard about during this course, this way of thinking has changed a bit recently from this idea that there is nature and there is society and they're somehow influencing each other. So this basic idea has moved a bit recently to this conceptualization that everything that happens in human society is actually fundamentally based on nature and what's going on in nature and on natural resources we have. So we as a society, of course, can influence a lot of things, and we can somehow influence the course which we want to. So what I copied in here are recent or not that recent publications from either journals or scientific journals, and those are papers that are looking at this issue of people influencing the planet to a very large extent these days. So-called idea of the Anthropocene. I'm not sure if you guys heard about it, but anyway, nod or shake. Did you guys heard about it? You did. Someone did, someone didn't. Anyway, this word just means that we are living in this era when humans are so influential and they have so much influence about society and ecosystems that we can even call this era as this anthropogenically influenced geologic era. That's the reasoning behind Anthropocene. And another idea is that these changes that are happening on this planet these days are so huge that we are actually maybe approaching to some kind of boundaries in terms of different socio-ecological processes that might actually be so big and so substantial that can move us from this form of the system we are used to a totally different organization of the system. So we may basically somehow influence these natural bases of our well-being so much that we'll no longer be able to live in the same way on this planet as we are used to. So this is what I want to say about the extent into which we are influencing our planet today and why we are talking about the era of global change. So, so now knowing that all of us are from different backgrounds, from your point of view, what are the major drivers of this global change today? Like, what are these things that influence global change to such an extent today? Population growth. Cool. Mm-hmm. Economic growth, for sure. Absolutely.
Carbon dioxide emissions.
One more.
Carbon dioxide emissions.
Mm-hmm. Yes, for sure. Carbon dioxide emissions and climate change. There is actually more of them. I mean, we mentioned demographic drivers, economic drivers, and there are political drivers, political changes, which influence these all systems. Changes in technology, in, let's say, the yields of agricultural products that we can reach. There are changes in societies and in cultural traits of the society. So all these groups of drivers are very important. And then we are coming to ecological drivers, and now we have mentioned greenhouse greenhouse gas emissions as the primary one of them. But then there are more. There is land degradation, which is very, very current here in Kyrgyzstan. Land transformation, the rise in urban areas. So there are a lot of different drivers, both social and environmental. They're causing this complex climate change and global change in which we are living. Does it make sense a little bit? Cool. Good. A little bit more. And okay, so we're getting a bit further in this chain of thoughts. So we are living on Earth, which is a complex system of nature and society, and we are facing some substantial issues called global change in general. And then for the last 50 years, 60 years, people have been trying to figure out what to do with this, what to do with this world, which is very complex. Everything is linked to everything else. And we are facing some problems, and we are trying to see how to move into the future in some kind of way which would be good for us as humans, to promote our well-being. And then this idea of sustainability raised. The idea of some kind of way of thinking that would allow us and the future generations to live in a way which wouldn't be harmful for people coming after us and also for us, and which would allow us to reach the same level of human well-being also in the future. And then when you look at this timeline, in the beginning the idea was simple. Okay, so we've got economy, we've got environment, and we've got human society. And if these three pillars all work well, everything will work well. So we've got three things which are somehow connected, but if we treat them separately and if we treat them well, everything will work fine. But then it turned out that this is not the case, because these things, economy, society, and environment, they interact. You can't just focus on one of them and try to fix it while ignoring the others. All these things are in interaction. So we are again getting to this idea of things being linked together. So the idea developed furthermore to this notion of things connected together and some goals which, tell me, have you already had a lecture on sustainable development goals?
Yes.
You did? Great, okay. So what emerged was this idea of some goals that link all these three pillars together: environmental pillar, economic pillar, and social pillar. Some goals that are comprehensive, and each of them incorporates all these parts. And that is important. That is important because it makes us think about the world in these links and connections, and not separately. The final slide on this, and then I promise I'll leave it, is this one, where you can see the original 17 SDGs, then somehow hierarchized. Can I say this word? Hierarchical. Thank you. So you can see that these authors of this paper have tried to somehow show which of the SDGs needs to be reached so that the others can be reached. And what you can see here is that these SDGs that are linked to nature are actually fundamental for the others. Like when you want to reach the SDGs that are closely linked to economy, we need to be alive, and we need to be able to breathe, and we need to be able to eat. So all these things are nested in natural ecosystems. And that's the idea that I want you to bring out from the slide. That natural resources are fundamental for human existence and human well-being. And then this idea of sustainability is, of course, incorporated in a lot of international strategies, and policies, and agendas, and so on. So, can you think of some international or Kyrgyz initiative or agreement or convention or strategy that is somehow linked to sustainable development? I'm sure you can. There are more. Okay, so we have covered water, we have covered climate change, we have covered environment in a way. There are more, guys.
For peace, we have, I think, a conference about Syria in Kazakhstan. We just had.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Conference about
society, like peace building in
Uh-huh.
Syria.
Interesting. Okay, I didn't hear of that one. Okay. Yeah. So, just as you've mentioned, I'll probably have this one too. Yeah. So let's start from the local initiatives. They're both regional, as you mentioned, like Central Asian, and national initiatives that are somehow linked to this idea of sustainable development. And because I'm an ecologist originally, for me, the first idea was National Biodiversity Strategy, which is valid here in Kyrgyzstan. Then Kyrgyzstan also has this National Sustainable Development Strategy for the country. And then Kyrgyzstan has the obligation to monitor for multiple international organizations and conventions, such as United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, United Nations Convention on Climate Change that you just mentioned, and also this International Convention on Biological Diversity. I'm not sure if you guys heard about it. Who heard about CBD? No one! So, for several decades now, there is this international convention existing that's basically focusing on ecosystems and on biological diversity, on all the species that are living in the world. This is signed by almost all nations on the earth, in the world. And basically the convention says that we're going to try to stop biodiversity loss, that we are aware of the fact that species and biodiversity is important for human well-being, and we are going to protect it in a way. But also on ecosystems in general, on parts of nature that work together and function in a way. So there are initiatives looking at biodiversity, ecosystems, and then also sustainable development in general, such as Agenda 21, which you've definitely heard about, and sustainable development goals. So what I mean to say is that there are multiple initiatives looking at this topic from different perspectives, from the perspective of biological diversity, from the perspective of ecosystems, from the perspective of human society and economy. So again, you can see that there are a lot of things going on which tend to take into account both the natural world and the social world together. And I know that I'm like trying to talk about this a lot, but it's very important for what I'm going to say next. So yeah, that's why I'm sorry if I'm making it too simple for you. Just tell me. I don't want to make it too simple for you. So now we're getting to some terms that we are going to meet further on when we're going to talk about natural capital accounting. First of them, naturally, is natural capital. So, any ideas? Who guys studied natural capital in the past? Does anyone know what we mean by natural capital? And then, quite often I've been using this term ecosystems, which we can think of as these dynamic and complex systems of plants and animals and their habitats and all the energy that's flowing through the system and all the material that's flowing through the system. So ecosystem basically are these holistic systems of all the living and non-living things that interact together. For example, I know that in Kyrgyzstan it's super popular to go to Ecological in summer. So this Ecological can be thought of as one ecosystem, a lake ecosystem, where there's fish, where there's energy, where there are nutrients, where there are plants, and all these things interact together. Another example of ecosystem can be a specific pasture, maybe close to your hometown, where the animals and the herds and the sheep and the horses, everything interacts together. They're feeding the grass, and maybe the grass is being manured or being fertilized. So all these inputs of materials and inputs of energy, and then all these things living there together and interacting, all of this can be described as ecosystem. Does it make any sense? Yeah? Okay. And now we're getting back as another definition which we are using a lot during this lecture. Now we are getting back to this idea of the services that are generated by natural capital. Do you remember that we talked about the goods and services that are derived from natural capital? And here we go. Those are these. We call them ecosystem services. And basically, that's the contribution of nature to to whatever we consume, to whatever we use, or to whatever we want to have in our lives. Basically, have you guys ever heard about ecosystem services? Yeah. So it's not a completely new... No, good. Have you guys heard about the fact that we tend to divide them into 3 groups or 4 groups?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so I'll presume that you guys know. Basically, ecosystem services are the contribution of nature to all the benefits that we are enjoying as humans and that we are using to sustain our lives and to enjoy our lives. And we tend to divide them into provisioning services, which are all the material things we are consuming, like crops, like food, like clean water, whatever we are consuming in a tangible way. Then we recognize regulating services, which are the services that make the planet a nice place to live. For example, the service of flood regulation or air filtration. These processes that help us to live in a nice and benign environment. And then cultural services, which are super important, which are all those like feelings we have from nice landscapes and all the reasons why we travel somewhere and all the reasons why we choose Issyk as a place to go for a holiday. All of these are cultural services. Yeah? I hope it makes sense a little bit. And we're getting towards the end of these definitions, which you guys also have in the handouts. So, someone came up with the idea that when we want to somehow conceptualize all these complex links between nature and society, it might be actually useful to be able to value all these stocks and services that we derive from natural capital. And that's where this idea of economic valuation of ecosystem services come from. So there are multiple economic instruments and procedures that allow us to put a specific price or value at ecosystem services and at ecosystems, which basically might help us to link this social world with the natural world, to see what we are actually using up from the nature and why we need it and what's the value of it. So that's the concept of valuation of ecosystem services. And with these terms now in our heads, and I hope you guys kind of have this notion of what I mean as important, we're getting to this idea of national capital accounting. We all know that there's some limitations about GDP. But anyway, it's a nice measure. But what it doesn't do, and what's very important, is that it doesn't take into account how much this natural capital we're talking about, how much it's utilized. We are basically not taking this account at all. And I hope that in my previous slides, guys, I kind of try to convince you that this is something we should take into account because we're using it and our lives and well-being is dependent on it. So GDP is a nice measure which actually doesn't take natural capital and its use into account at all. And then we're going a bit further. So we have this measure that's actually very useful. Everyone is using it. But we know that it's lacking a very important information on how much natural resources we are actually exploiting. And then all of us know that GDP is actually widely used. All policymakers use it as a kind of argumentation or as a kind of reasoning for doing things. And then, if you're lacking some kind of information in GDP, it means that actually these decisions by the policymakers can lead to unsustainable use of natural capital. It can lead to degradation of natural resources, which we might kind of regret in the future. So this all might lead to some impacts, which might influence our lives or the lives of our children in the future. And that's why, going back, we need to do something about it, because that means that there is some kind of measure that's widely used, but it's actually wrong in a way. And I'm simplifying it a lot, so forgive me. So, what I'm talking about is that if you look at the example of grazing and of production of animal products, in this system, which is actually taken from the system of American ecosystem accounting, you can see that we are starting with an ecosystem, with a pasture in this case, and then we're grazing animals in the pasture. And then we're enjoying these benefits that the pasture gives us, and it creates our individual and societal well-being. I think this is pretty straightforward, right? So then, why is the ecosystem so important? Well, it's basically important because it provides us with the grass that the animals actually eat. And then, of course, there are important inputs by human society. Like, if there wasn't human input, we couldn't enjoy these benefits at all. So there are these two important parts, human input and the natural input. But for calculating GDP, this whole part is not taken into account. When you calculate GDP, you only take into account what's going on within the economic system, within the human system. So all of this is basically ignored. And this vague line that I've just drawn here, and which of course is like precisely defined and you can read a lot about it. This line is called production boundary. Who has heard it before?
Yeah.
Economists are nodding, right? So yeah, in economics it's pretty much like used in straightforward term. But anyway, production boundary just means which things we are actually taking into account when we are calculating some measure, in this case GDP. So what we are actually taking into account. And in the standard accounting, which uses GDP, it's always this, the economic and human part, not this. And, as I just said, GDP, which is widely used, is calculated based on a set of norms that's called System of National Accounting. I'm going to talk about it in a second. Our aim is to incorporate the natural capital into this system of national accounting so that all the ecological parts were also taken into account when we are calculating GDP and other measures. In the rest of the slide, I have some examples. Yeah. I think that you guys can actually read it at home because it's not very important. And we will get the slides, so you will read the examples. So, I've already mentioned this system of national accounting, system of national accounts. That's the set of norms and rules which have been developed by United Nations throughout the 20th century and which tells us how to calculate important and commonly used measures of economic activity or economic development. So the most current version was developed in 2008. It's called 2008 System of National Accounts. And it gives us this comprehensive information about how GDP should be calculated. Anyone can download it, anyone can read it, it's online. So, I mean, that's a great standard, which most of the countries in the world are using. But what we know now is that there's one huge shortage, and that is that actually this system doesn't take into account environmental stocks and the flows of ecosystem services at all. So what we should do is try to figure out how to do this, how to incorporate all these stocks and flows into this measure of GDP and into other measures. And the solution that United Nations have come up with is called a system of environmental economic accounting, SEEA, and I'm going to get there in a second. So now I think that we are kind of ready to make clear what natural capital accounting actually is. So what it is this process which helps us to calculate the total stocks and flows of natural resources we have and all the services that we are using, that we are deriving from these ecosystems, the ecosystem services, and how to quantify them in physical or in monetary terms. And you guys see that's very broad. That's a very broad definition. And I mean, let's just say that at this point this is just fine. It's just fine to know what it is. Because then we can of course go into depth, and that's not needed now. But basically what we need to know now is that natural capital accounting is this process of quantifying the stocks and flows of natural resources and ecosystem services. And what's important is that natural capital accounting as an approach, as a newly established approach, which is just on the run now, helps us to somehow capture, unlike GDP, what is the contribution of natural capital to human well-being. So natural capital is actually this patch that we are using to this problem I was talking about in the last slide. Is the solution that we can use to link the information about the environment to the information about the economy and to merge them together. And in economic terms, what I want you to know is that what natural capital accounting does is that it's actually moving this production boundary I was talking about a while ago. It's moving it so that even the environmental stocks and flows fit in, so that we can capture them in GDP. So basically, natural capital accounting tells us which processes or which procedures we can apply so that we can incorporate all of this into the measure of GDP. Does it make sense?
I have a question. How we can prevent the overestimation of GDP in this case if we include environmental accounting?
I guess that maybe you're pointing at this issue of double counting that we are or no? You mean that? Tell me more. You mean?
I mean, if we include environmental accounting, natural capital accounting to the GDP, how we will be sure that we are not overestimating the value of or underestimating the value of nature to GDP.
Well, that's a very good question, and I mean, yes, it's important to take it into account and know about this issue. And to be honest, the procedures and the methods are not in place yet. We can't say that, okay, this is the set of methods that are proven to work well, and we can be sure about not underestimating or overestimating the value. It's not there yet, but it's the aim. Yeah. So the development of these methods is actually taking this into account, but no final answer yet, unfortunately. Thanks for the question. So now we know what natural capital accounting is, and then just as we were discussing right now, this is all very new. This is the idea that's been developed for several years, but it's definitely not something finalized. There are a lot of initiatives that are looking at natural capital accounting and trying to pilot it in different areas. First one of them is the WAVES initiative that's run by World Bank, and that's an initiative that's trying to pilot natural capital accounting in different countries, in different local studies, and see what are the shortages, what are the issues, and what might be the solutions. What's interesting is that Kyrgyzstan has just become a partner country for WAVES, and the activities will start this year. So that will be very interesting to follow. And then there are other initiatives, a world initiative on quantifying the economic value of ecosystems and biodiversity, some initiatives in the European Union, some country initiatives which you can read about, search that. And then the initiative which I'm going to talk about the most, and that's an initiative run by the United Nations called System of Environmental Economic Accounting. So what I want you guys to notice is that this system, this abbreviation, which you're going to see throughout the rest of the presentation, is somehow linked to natural capital accounting. It's a part of it. It is one of the approaches how to perform it. But if you go into depth, you'll find out that there are some substantial differences in terms of economic methods and economic thinking that are actually distinguishing this from other natural capital accounting initiatives. That is not important for us now. It's not an issue. If you guys are interested in the details, let me know. I'll be happy to explain. But let's just not go there. Let's take it the way that SEEA, System of Environmental Economic Accounting, is an approach developed by United Nations, which is trying to show us which procedures can be taken to perform natural capital accounting. Does it make sense? Thank you. Okay. So just briefly, I'll take the time. Okay. Just briefly, here you can see the development of this SEEA, this approach to natural capital accounting developed by the United Nations. You can see that it was gradually developing from the 90s, so it's really fresh, really new. And it was developed in certain steps, and I'll focus on two of them. The first important step for us is 2012, where this so-called central framework of SEEA was developed. And the central framework is the basic document that tells us what natural capital is. That's what we have just been discussing. That it incorporates land, water, forests, minerals, energy, and all these stocks. And then we can somehow calculate their value. That's what this central framework is looking at. But then you guys, listening to me all this time, now realize that this is not all. That this like non-living world, natural world, is not all. We also have this living part, the ecosystems, and those are also working for us. So the next step in the next year was the development of another SEEA guideline, which is called, now it becomes kind of terrible, System of Environmental Economic Accounting, Experimental Ecosystem Accounting. This. And here in the name you can see that it's some kind of like addition to the original central framework, looking specifically at ecosystems and ecosystem services. Those services that nature provides us. We can somehow calculate what is the aggregate value of all these services provided by our ecosystems. And then we can see if this value of our ecosystems is actually rising in time, if the ecosystems are able to produce more and more services and not being degraded, or if we are degrading our ecosystems, if we can envision that the production of ecosystem services will be actually much lower in the future. And then this information on the provision of services and on the degradation can be integrated to standard tables which we are already producing within our statistical systems. We can link this information and see if the production, if the economic production in our country is actually depleting the natural resources we have, or if it's using it in a sustainable way. That's why we are doing it. We want to see if the economic development that we have in the country is sustainable, if we can be sure that we can develop in the same way in the future, or if we are using too much, if we are using too much natural resources, and it won't be possible to develop in the same way in the future. Does this make sense? Yes. Okay. Okay, guys, so this will be very brief. I just want to show you how the accounts look like. These are 4 slides and I'll run through it, right? So the account for land, for ecosystems, basically tells us how much of different types of ecosystems we have in the country. How much we had in the beginning of the year, how much we had at the end of the year, and what was the change in between. Yeah? Then we have ecosystem condition accounts. We can look at different types of ecosystems and then think about what is the best information we can get about their condition. For example, let's look at water resources, important in this time. We can look at what is the level of river flows, what is the water quality in different streams, what fish species we have in these ecosystems. So we can basically look at like how healthy the ecosystems are. Here you can see that this requires a lot of expertise, because for each of these indicators you need experts to be able to calculate them, and you need a lot of data to calculate it from. So looks like an easy task is not an easy task. And then we have the accounts for all these types of ecosystem services, which we talked about, for provisioning services, for cultural services, and for regulating services. And here again, for provisioning services, to make these tables is kind of easy, because you already have statistics for all these products that they're used by society, for all food, for all timber. In every country, more or less, these numbers are available. So that's kind of easy, because it can be based on existing data. But then, cultural services. Kyrgyzstan is a beautiful country, full of tourists. People are coming to see how beautiful mountains you guys have. But then, is there any information about it? Is there any information about how many people are coming? Or what they're using? Or which services they're using? No, we don't know that. And also for all these like less visible services, such as, let's say, flood protection or erosion protection. That's very important in many parts of Kyrgyzstan, but we have no data about it. So all these tables, they're compiled within natural capital accounting, require a lot of modeling, a lot of expertise, and a lot of data. Because what I want to say now is like this most important thing about this all. And that's because you already know why we're doing it, you already know like why it's important, and now we want to know why is it important here, why is it important in this specific country, how can it help us with the issues that we are already having. So, what's great about this system of environmental ecosystem accounting is that it provides lots of methods and lots of processes how to use very fragmented data that we have scattered all around, information on land use, information on water, information in the statistical office, how we can take this and somehow harmonize the data, put it together, and compile it into very nice accounts, very nice tables that are actually based on good data, and then derive like indicators of how good the data actually was in the beginning, so that next time when we are doing this, probably next year, we can do better. Yeah. So it's somehow providing us with procedures how to manage all this information that we have in different agencies, in different institutes, in different ministries, how to work with it so that we can provide high quality information. And yeah, this is kind of important because now I think that you guys realize that this natural capital accounting can provide us a great information which tells us if we're using our natural capital sustainably or not, and if we are going to get into troubles in the future or not. So we need to know. But for us to know, we need these accounts, we need these tables. And to get these tables, you already know that we need all this information. We need to know how much cattle we have. We need to know where we have the forests. We need to know where is the water. We need to know how clean it is. We need a lot of data. And then coming to this is an issue in most countries. In my country, I guess in Kyrgyzstan too, because data is a problem. Not only statistical data, but also spatial data, maps, and all these data sets. So, because you guys are going to be the ones who are going to do this in the future, not only this, but everything, like you're going to develop all of this important stuff in this country. This is something which is important to bring out from this lecture, that whatever you want to do, you need to know, and to know means to have data. So, investments in collecting this information, the maps and the tables and statistical data, and investments in capacity building and in collaboration between people and between institutes, that's super important, because without it, you're not getting anywhere, never. Another important thing is that this approach of natural capital accounting allows us to link together thinking about different things and to consider them in the complex way, and then to manage them better. For example, it links together the energy, water, and food. We get information about all these things together, and it can help us consider if our food production is sustainable, if our water management is sustainable, and if our energy management is sustainable. So the advantage of this whole system is that it's a system. It links things together and provides us information about everything at once, so we can compare and we can derive some decisions. So, I guess that this is something you have captured throughout this lecture, that this advantage of natural capital accounting is that it provides us with knowledge, and it's also a process which is teaching people. So it's a process that provides us with some data, and also provides us with some capacity that we can use for other initiatives. What I want to say is that when a country is working on ecosystem accounting, it's actually not doing an extra work. It's contributing to multiple monitoring obligations and to multiple international conventions, and a lot of tasks that would have to be done anyway. So it's not extra work. It's something that really helps with a lot of other stuff. And what it helps with, the most important thing, is with monitoring the implementation of SDGs. Why? Because two things. One is that you are aware that some of the SDGs are actually focusing on the environment. And in this case, it's pretty straightforward. You can basically use some of the data that you capture for SEA for monitoring these SDGs. So that's all right, that's super easy. But regardless of that, when someone asks you, okay, so how does SEA contribute to SDGs? You can say, yeah, well, it basically provides you with some data, which you need. But also, it provides you with a lot of mechanisms. It provides you with these new collaborations that are being established, with this new thinking about data. It provides you with this idea that you need to think about things in an integrated way, that you need to link environment with society. And all these things are like, it's a kind of training that the country goes through when they're trying to implement SEA. And that's why it's so important. It provides people with new capabilities that probably were not there before, at least in my country. So, if you need some very concise information, here you have SDGs. Here you have this original system of national accounting, which we already know that is a system that teaches us how to calculate GDP. And here are the new guidelines, which also consider environment, as we learned, yeah? Which are moving the production boundary and which are calculating GDP in a more complex way. And here you can see, color-coded, which SDGs these guidelines contribute to. And as you can see, if we're using just this original system, national accounting, we're missing a lot of information. While these two new guidelines, these two new standards for national capital accounting, provide us with more information that we can use for monitoring SDGs. So it's not something that you would be doing as an extra task. It's something that actually helps you to see how sustainably you act. If you have any questions, then feel free to ask. If you have any more questions, feel free to write to me.